How could you see an old woman, barely able to carry her groceries, as a threat? Marcus's voice cut through the courtroom, eyes locked on Officer Parker. She was simply trying to get home, and you treated her like a criminal. The room was silent, everyone waiting for the truth to shatter the lies. Welcome to our channel, where powerful stories unfold and voices demand to be heard. Get ready for inspiring tales of justice, courage, and change. It was a sunny afternoon, and Mrs. Eloise, a kind elderly black woman, was on her way back from the local grocery store. She walked slowly, carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries, but she didn't mind. She had just picked up some fresh vegetables and ingredients to make a special soup for a neighbor who wasn't feeling well. Mrs. Eloise was known around the neighborhood for her kindness and always had a warm smile for everyone she met. As she made her way across the street, she noticed a police car parked nearby. Officer Parker was sitting inside, keeping an eye on the busy area. He was a tall, stern-looking man, and he had a reputation for being strict and tough. As Mrs. Eloise passed by, she noticed him watching her closely, but she didn't think much of it. She adjusted her bags and continued walking. Suddenly, Officer Parker stepped out of his car and approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone sharp. Mrs. Eloise stopped and turned to him, slightly confused. "Yes, officer. How can I help you?" she asked politely. "You match the description of someone we've been looking for," he said, narrowing his eyes. "I'm going to need you to answer a few questions." Mrs. Eloise's eyes widened in surprise. "I'm sorry, sir, but there must be some mistake. I'm just heading home with my groceries." But Officer Parker didn't seem to be listening. "Let me see what's in your bags," he demanded. Mrs. Eloise hesitated, unsure why she was being treated this way. But she nodded and slowly opened one of her bags to show him. "I have some vegetables, bread, and a few cans of soup. Nothing else." Officer Parker glanced at the items but didn't seem satisfied. "I need you to cooperate," he said, his voice growing harsher. "I don't want any trouble." Mrs. Eloise was beginning to feel scared. She had done nothing wrong, and she didn't understand why this was happening. "Officer, I promise you, I'm not causing any trouble. I'm just going home," she said softly, trying to stay calm. But Officer Parker's patience was running out. He felt like she wasn't taking him seriously, and his frustration turned to anger. "I said cooperate," he shouted, stepping closer. Mrs. Eloise flinched, startled by his sudden outburst, and tried to back away. But before she could say anything, Officer Parker raised his hand and struck her across the face. The blow was so strong that Mrs. Eloise fell to the ground, her bag scattering as she collapsed. Her head hit the pavement hard, and everything went dark. Bystanders nearby gasped in horror, and some immediately pulled out their phones to record what was happening. A few rushed to Mrs. Eloise's side, shouting at Officer Parker, "What are you doing? She's an old lady." But Officer Parker wasn't paying attention. His hands were shaking, and for a moment, he realized what he had done. Panic started to set in as he looked down at Mrs. Eloise, lying unconscious on the ground. He could hear people around him yelling, but his mind was racing too fast to make sense of it all. He didn't know what to do, and the fear was creeping up on him. As the sounds of sirens approached, Officer Parker's heart pounded. What had he done? The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, but the mood was anything but calm. Mrs. Eloise had been rushed to the hospital, unconscious, and the doctors were doing everything they could to stabilize her. News of the incident spread like wildfire, and within hours, people all over town were talking about what had happened. Mrs. Eloise was loved by everyone in the community. She had spent years volunteering at the local community center, organizing food drives, and helping neighbors in need. The idea that someone would hurt her was unthinkable. Outside the hospital, a small crowd had gathered. Friends, neighbors, and even people who barely knew Mrs. Eloise stood together, worried and angry. Some were holding candles, while others prayed silently, hoping she would wake up. Mrs. Johnson, A friend who lived across the street from Mrs. Eloise had tears in her eyes. "She doesn't deserve this," she said to no one in particular. "She's the sweetest person I know." Meanwhile, videos of the incident had started to appear online. Bystanders had recorded the moment Officer Parker hit Mrs. Eloise, and the footage was quickly shared on social media. People were shocked and outraged. "How could he do that to an old lady?" One person commented. "This is disgusting." "She did nothing wrong," wrote another. The videos painted a grim picture, and it was clear that Mrs. Eloise had been treated unfairly. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for Eloise was trending, and more people began showing up outside the hospital and police station, demanding answers. Inside the police station, Officer Parker was trying to keep his cool. He had given his statement, insisting that he thought Mrs. Eloise was a suspect and that she was resisting him. "I was just trying to do my job," he repeated, hoping his colleagues would back him up. But even some of the other officers were starting to feel uneasy. They had seen the videos too, and it didn't look good. They knew Mrs. Eloise was well known and well loved, and the community was not going to let this go easily. As the night went on, more people gathered outside the station, holding signs and chanting for justice. "Say her name." "Eloise," they shouted. There was a sense of unity among them, a collective determination to make sure what happened wasn't ignored. The community wanted answers, and they wanted accountability. They were tired of seeing people treated unfairly, and Mrs. Eloise's gentle nature made the incident even more painful to accept. Officer Parker could hear the chants from his desk. His hands were trembling as he tried to focus on writing his report. He hadn't expected this reaction, and he certainly hadn't expected to feel so much pressure. He kept telling himself that he did nothing wrong, but deep down, a part of him was starting to panic. "What if this ruins me?" he thought. As the community continued to gather, holding candles and signs, the hospital remained quiet. Mrs. Eloise was still in a coma, and her condition was critical. Doctors had done all they could, but they couldn't say when, or even if, she would wake up. The thought of her lying there, alone and unconscious, only made the people outside more determined. They knew one thing. They wouldn't rest until there was justice for Mrs. Eloise. Word of the incident spread far and wide, eventually reaching a man in another state, Mrs. Eloise's son, Marcus. Marcus was at work when he received a call from a concerned neighbor, telling him about what had happened. At first, he couldn't believe it. There must be a mistake, he thought. His mother was one of the kindest people he knew. She would never get into trouble, let alone have a confrontation with the police. But as he listened, his heart sank. The neighbor explained how Mrs. Eloise had been hurt, how she was in a coma, and how there were videos online showing the whole incident. Marcus's hands shook as he hung up the phone. He couldn't waste any time. Without a second thought, he packed his bags, booked the first flight home, and rushed to the airport, his mind racing with worry and anger. Marcus was a successful and well-known lawyer, having won many high-profile cases. But in that moment, none of that mattered. He wasn't thinking about courtrooms or legal battles. He was thinking about his mom lying in a hospital bed, alone and unconscious. As he boarded the plane, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: fear, sadness, and a growing rage. How could this happen to her? He kept asking himself. He vowed that he would find out the truth, no matter what it took. By the time Marcus arrived at the hospital, it was late at night. He rushed through the doors, barely pausing to speak to the receptionist. He found his way to his mother's room, where she lay still, hooked up to machines. The sight of her, so fragile and vulnerable, broke his heart. He gently took her hand, his eyes filling with tears. "I'm here, Mom," he whispered. "I'm going to make this right." The next morning, Marcus visited the doctors and got an update on Mrs. Eloise's condition. The news wasn't good. She was in a deep coma, and the doctors couldn't say when she might wake up. Marcus felt a wave of despair, but he quickly pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to lose hope. He had to be strong for his mom, and he had to make sure that whoever hurt her was held accountable. As soon as he left the hospital, Marcus headed straight to the police station. He had already seen the videos online, and he knew the name of the officer involved: Officer Parker. Marcus had spent his career fighting for justice, but this was different. This was personal. When he walked into the station, he carried himself with calm determination, but inside, he was boiling with anger. He demanded to speak with the police chief, introducing himself as Mrs. Eloise's son. The officers at the station didn't know who he was, but they could see the seriousness in his eyes. When the police chief met Marcus, he tried to explain the situation, saying that it was all a misunderstanding. But Marcus didn't want excuses. He wanted answers. "My mother is in a coma because of your officer's actions," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I want to know why she was treated like that, and I want to see all the evidence, including any footage you have from that day." The police chief hesitated. He had heard of Marcus, the sharp lawyer who never lost a case. Now he realized that the situation was much more serious than they had thought. Officer Parker, who had been watching from a distance, felt his stomach drop when he heard who Marcus was. Panic began to set in as he realized that this wasn't just going to go away. Marcus's presence at the station changed everything. He wasn't just a grieving son. He was a powerful advocate who would not rest until justice was served. As he prepared to dig deeper into the case, the community's hope began to grow. Maybe, just maybe, with Marcus on their side, there was a chance that the truth would come out, and that Mrs. Eloise would get the justice she deserved. Marcus sat across from the police chief, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He had demanded access to every piece of evidence related to his mother's case: police reports, surveillance footage, and statements from witnesses. The police chief hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We're still conducting our investigation," he said, trying to maintain control of the situation. "But you have to understand, Officer Parker was just doing his job." Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm not here for excuses. I'm here for the truth. My mother is in a coma, and I have the right to know why." The police chief could feel the pressure mounting. He knew that Marcus was a skilled lawyer, and that if they didn't cooperate, this could turn into a bigger problem than they could handle. With a reluctant nod, he handed over the files and authorized Marcus to view the bodycam footage. As Marcus reviewed the videos, he was horrified. The bodycam footage showed Officer Parker's aggressive behavior, his harsh tone, and the moment he hit Mrs. Eloise. Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he knew he had to keep his emotions in check. He also saw clips from bystanders' phones, which captured Mrs. Eloise's calm demeanor and the shocking moment she was struck without any provocation. It was clear that Officer Parker had overstepped his authority, but what shocked Marcus even more was what he found buried in the files: previous complaints against Officer Parker for excessive force. It turned out that Officer Parker had a history of aggressive behavior, but the complaints had never been taken seriously. They were either dismissed or quietly resolved without any real investigation. Marcus realized that this wasn't just about his mother. It was about a system that had allowed someone like Officer Parker to abuse his power without facing consequences. With this new information, Marcus knew exactly what to do. He called a press conference and stood in front of cameras, holding up the police reports and playing clips from the footage for the world to see. "My mother was not just the victim of one officer's violent behavior," he said, his voice echoing with strength and conviction. "She was the victim of a system that failed to hold this officer accountable, even when there were clear signs of abuse. This has to stop, and I will not rest until justice is served." The police station was in chaos. Officer Parker watched the press conference on a small TV in the break room, his hands trembling. He had thought he could talk his way out of this, but now he realized just how serious the situation had become. Marcus's presence, his calm but powerful voice, and the undeniable evidence had turned the tide. The entire community was rallying behind Mrs. Eloise, and the pressure on the police department was mounting. Officer Parker began to panic. He knew that Marcus had the skills, and the determination to dismantle his defense, piece by piece. For the first time, he was truly scared. He had never thought that the woman he had hit would have someone so powerful fighting for her. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a growing fear that his career, and possibly his freedom, were on the line. Meanwhile, the community felt a renewed sense of hope. People who had once been afraid to speak out were now sharing their own experiences of mistreatment, inspired by Marcus's bravery and dedication. Mrs. Eloise's story had become a symbol of a larger fight for justice, and Marcus had given them a voice. As Marcus continued to gather evidence and prepare for a legal battle, he felt a bittersweet satisfaction. He was closer than ever to bringing Officer Parker to justice, but he knew that no victory could erase the pain of seeing his mother in a hospital bed, fighting for her life. Still, he pressed on, knowing that this fight wasn't just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced and mistreated. The case was no longer just about his mother's assault. It was about exposing the truth, and Marcus was determined to make sure the world would see it. The courtroom was packed, with reporters, community members, and supporters all gathered to witness what had become one of the most high-profile cases in the city. Marcus stood tall, dressed sharply in his suit, ready to fight for his mother and for justice. He had spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence, and building a solid case against Officer Parker. Now, it was time to face him in court. As the trial began, the tension in the room was palpable. Officer Parker sat at the defense table, looking nervous and pale. His usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. He had hired a lawyer to defend him, but even they seemed uncertain about how to handle the overwhelming evidence against him. Marcus had managed to get his hands on witness testimonies, body cam footage, and a record of previous complaints against Officer Parker. The case was strong, and everyone in the room could feel it. Marcus opened his arguments by playing the videos that had circulated online, showing the shocking moment when Officer Parker struck Mrs. Eloise. Gasps filled the room as the footage played, and it was clear to everyone watching that there was no justification for what had happened. "This is not about a misunderstanding," Marcus said, his voice steady and powerful. "This is about an abuse of power. Officer Parker used unnecessary and brutal force against an innocent elderly woman, and he must be held accountable." The defense tried to argue that Officer Parker was acting in self-defense, claiming that he thought Mrs. Eloise was a threat. But Marcus was prepared. He questioned Officer Parker on the stand, calmly but firmly dismantling his excuses. "How could you see an old woman, barely able to carry her groceries, as a threat?" Marcus asked, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "She did not resist. She did not provoke. She was simply trying to get home, and you treated her like a criminal." The defense's arguments began to fall apart under Marcus's relentless questioning. He brought out the records of previous complaints against Officer Parker, showing a pattern of aggressive behavior that had been ignored by the department. "This was not an isolated incident," Marcus said, looking directly at the jury. "This was the result of a system that failed to hold an officer accountable for his actions, and my mother paid the price for that failure." As the trial progressed, the community continued to rally around Marcus. People from all over the city came forward to share their support, and outside the courthouse, crowds gathered with signs calling for justice. It was clear that this case had become more than just about Mrs. Eloise. It was about fighting against a system that had let people down for too long. Finally, after days of testimony and arguments, the jury reached a verdict. The room was silent as the judge read it out. "We find the defendant, Officer Parker, guilty of assault and abuse of power." A collective sigh of relief washed over the courtroom, and the supporters outside cheered. Officer Parker slumped in his seat, the reality of his actions crashing down on him. He would face consequences for what he had done, and his days as an officer were over. Marcus felt a wave of emotion as he stood there, hearing the verdict. It was a bittersweet victory. He was proud to have fought for his mother and to have brought justice, but the thought of her still lying in a coma weighed heavily on his heart. He left the courtroom and headed straight to the hospital, where he spent every day by Mrs. Eloise's side, talking to her, holding her hand, and hoping she would wake up. A few days after the trial, something miraculous happened. As Marcus sat next to his mother's bed, telling her about how the community had come together to support her, he felt her fingers twitch. He looked up, and to his shock and joy, he saw her eyes slowly open. Mrs. Eloise's eyes were tired, but she managed a small, weak smile when she saw her son. Marcus's heart filled with hope as he squeezed her hand. "Mom, you did it," he said, tears streaming down his face. "You brought people together, and you made a difference." Mrs. Eloise was still weak, but she was awake, and that was all that mattered. The community's fight for justice had not only brought Officer Parker to account, but it had also sparked changes within the police department. New policies were introduced, and officers were required to undergo more rigorous training to prevent such incidents from happening again. As Mrs. Eloise slowly recovered, Marcus continued his work, inspired by the strength and resilience of his mother. The case had changed everything, and it had shown the world that when people come together and fight for what's right, real change can happen. Thank you for watching. If you want more impactful stories, don't forget to subscribe and let us know what inspired you the most in the comments below.